6 months had passed since the creature from the Hollowing retreated from Meridian 6, and the galaxy had changed in ways that Una still struggled to comprehend. She stood before the mirror in her quarters aboard Galactic Union Central Command and adjusted the collar of her dress uniform. A uniform she had never expected to wear and still did not feel she deserved. The face looking back at her was older than the face of the clerk who had made a typing error on a tired night shift. Harder around the edges and steadier in the eyes, but still unmistakably hers. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts, and she opened it to find Captain Shin standing in the corridor with Sergeant Crethval looming behind him. "It is time," Shin said simply. They walked together through corridors filled with beings from 100 different worlds, and Una noticed the way people stepped aside when they saw the insignia on her uniform. The crossed quill and sword that marked her as a veteran of the Meridian campaign. The war with the Keth had ended not with victory or defeat, but with understanding, and the treaty that bore the name of that burning world had been built on the foundation of Una's documentation. She had spent weeks after the Hollowing probe's appearance translating between Elder Kethrix and Galactic Union officials, using her administrative skills to navigate the bureaucratic maze that stood between two species and peace. Every form she had filled out in every protocol she had cited and every regulation she had memorized during her years as a clerk became tools in a negotiation that would determine the fate of billions, and in the end, the Galactic Union and the Keth Swarm had signed an alliance against the darkness that waited between the galaxies. The Great Hall of Central Command was filled with delegates from every member species of the Union, and Una walked down the central aisle with the survivors of the 47th Battalion flanking her like an honor guard. Private Jinho Beek walked behind her with his head held high and his hands steady on his ceremonial weapon. And Una remembered the frightened boy she had found hiding in the tunnels and felt pride swell in her chest. Myray was there too, wearing medic insignia that now included commendations for actions under fire. And she smiled at Una with the warmth of a friend forged in the fires of war. Even Commander Lim stood among the assembly, her face carefully neutral as she watched the clerk, who had defied her walk toward the highest honor the Union could bestow. At the end of the aisle stood a podium where the highest honor, the Union could bestow. At the end of the aisle stood a podium where the podium defied her walk toward the highest honor the Union could bestow. At the end of the aisle stood a podium where the Council of Species waited. 12 beings representing the 12 founding worlds of the Galactic Union. And among them Una saw a figure that made her breath catch in her throat. Elder Kethrix stood beside the human representative, its ancient eyes watching her approach with an expression she had learned to recognize as respect. The High Chancellor, a silver-furred Korvathi with a voice like distant thunder, raised one hand for silence. "We gather today to honor extraordinary service in extraordinary circumstances," the Chancellor said. 6 months ago, a data clerk named Una Park made an error that sent her to the most dangerous war zone in the quadrant. Today, we recognize that what seemed like a mistake became the catalyst for peace. Una climbed the steps to the podium and felt the weight of thousands of eyes pressing down on her. But she did not falter because she had faced far worse than an audience specialist. Una Park, the Chancellor continued, for actions above and beyond the call of duty, for courage in the face of certain death, for wisdom that prevented genocide and forged alliance from enmity. The Galactic Union awards you the Star of Meridian. The medal was heavier than Una expected when the Chancellor placed it around her neck, a gleaming symbol of recognition that she still believed belonged to someone else. But then she looked out at the faces watching her and saw Shin nodding with quiet pride, and Crethval's scarred face twisted into something that might have been a smile. and she understood that she had earned this moment one terrifying step at a time. "I'm supposed to give a speech," Yuna said, and her voice carried across the hall through speakers she could not see. "But I have never been good with words. I have always been better with forms and protocols and procedures." A ripple of laughter moved through the assembly, and Yuna felt some of her nervousness fade. "The truth is that I was never supposed to be there," she continued. "I made a mistake, and I was too scared to fight my way out of the situation, so I did the only thing I knew how to do. I processed information and followed protocols and tried to find solutions in the regulations I had memorized." She paused and looked at Elder Kethrix, and the ancient creature inclined its head in acknowledgement. "I did not save anyone through bravery or strength," Yuna said. "I saved them by being stubborn and scared and too foolish to know when to quit. I saved them by doing my job, even when my job was not supposed to be possible." The hall was silent now, and Yuna felt the words rising up from somewhere deep inside her. Words she had not planned to say. "Humans are strange creatures," she said. "We are soft and weak and we die easily, but we are also stubborn beyond reason. We take our small skills and we apply them to impossible problems. And sometimes we find answers that stronger species would never think to look for." She touched the metal hanging around her neck and felt the cold metal warming against her skin. "I am proud to have served with the 47th Battalion," she concluded. "I am proud to have helped end a war that never should have started. And I am proud to stand here today, even though I still think this medal belongs to the soldiers who actually knew what they were doing." The applause that followed was thunderous, and Yuna descended from the podium with tears in her eyes that she did not try to hide later. After the ceremony had ended, and the delegates had dispersed to their ships and their worlds, Yuna found Coordinator Vrel waiting for her in a quiet corridor. Her old supervisor looked exactly the same as he had on the night she had stumbled into his office begging him to fix her mistake. Calm and measured and impossible to read. "I need to tell you something," Vrel said, and his voice held a note she had never heard before. "What is it?" Yuna asked. "The transfer reversal," he said. "It would not have taken 6 weeks. I could have processed it in 6 hours if I had wanted to." Yuna stared at him as the meaning of his words sank in, and she felt anger and confusion and something else rising in her chest. "Why?" She demanded. Vrel's secondary arms folded in the gesture she had always interpreted as disappointment. But now she saw it differently. Now she saw it as contemplation. "I read your personnel file," he said. 17 commendations for efficiency. 0 promotions, 0 requests for advancement. 0 attempts to do anything other than process transfers in a dark room for the rest of your life. I saw someone wasting potential that could change the galaxy, so you sent me to die. Yuna said. "I sent you to live," Vrel corrected. "And I was right." He turned and walked away before she could respond. And Yuna stood alone in the corridor with the weight of the Star of Meridian around her neck and a future she had never imagined stretching out before her. The next morning she sat at a new desk in a new office, processing the first joint human-Keth military assignments for the defense fleet that would stand against the hollowing when it arrived. She checked every entry twice before submitting it. One misclick had changed her life, but she would make sure the next transformation was no accident. The ancient Keth called itself Elder Kethrix, and it had been sleeping in stasis for over a century while its species fought a desperate war against the Galactic Union. Yuna watched the creature with a mixture of fear and fascination as it lowered itself to the ground in a posture that seemed designed to make it appear smaller and less threatening. And she noticed the way the larvae in the chamber clustered around it as if seeking protection from the humans who had invaded their home. Captain Shin kept his weapon raised but did not fire, and the silence stretched between them like a wire about to snap. "You speak our language," Shin said. "How is that possible?" I learned it from the broadcasts your species sends across the stars. Kethrix replied, your entertainment programs and your news reports and your arguments with each other. All of it travels through space. And we have listened for many years. Why would you listen to us? Krethval demanded. We are your enemies. The elder's ancient eyes turned toward the Sarati, and Yuna thought she saw something like sadness in their faceted depths. We have no enemies, Kethrix said. We have only fear, and fear has driven us across galaxies for longer than your species has existed. Yuna stepped forward before she could stop herself, and her voice cut through the tension with a question that her administrative mind needed answered. What are you afraid of? The elder turned its attention to her, and she felt the weight of centuries pressing down on her shoulders as it studied her with eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall. We call it the hollowing. Kethrix said, it is not a creature or a fleet or a weapon. It is something else, something that consumes sentient life the way fire consumes wood. And it has followed us from our home galaxy, and it will find us again. It always finds us. That sounds like a story to make us hesitate. Shin said, then look at this and tell me what you see. The elder touched a control panel with one of its limbs, and a holographic display flickered to life above them, showing images that made Yuna's stomach turn with a horror she could not name. Stars going dark one by one across a spiral arm of a distant galaxy. Planets reduced to lifeless husks with their atmospheres stripped away. Ships larger than worlds drifting through the void like dead things, and behind it all, a darkness that seemed to move with purpose, a void that spread like a stain across the fabric of space itself. This is what we fled, Kethrix said. This is what destroyed 17 billion of our people before we escaped through the void between galaxies. And this is what follows us still, hunting for the minds it could not consume. Yuna looked at the images and felt a cold certainty settle into her bones, because she had spent years processing data and recognizing patterns. And the pattern she saw now was the pattern of extinction. Why attack us? She asked. Why not warn us instead? We tried, the elder replied. When we first arrived in your galaxy, we sent messages of peace and warning to every species we could find. But your union did not listen. Your leaders saw only invasion and threat. And when we tried to explain, they attacked our messenger ships and killed our diplomats. So you fought back, Shin said. We ran, Kethrix corrected. We always run, because running is how we survived when our homeworld burned. But your species would not let us run. You followed and attacked and forced us to defend ourselves. And defense requires spawning more warriors. And spawning more warriors requires more territory. And so the war grew beyond anyone's control. The door to the chamber burst open, and a squad of soldiers in heavier armor than Yuna had seen before rushed in with weapons raised and targeting systems painting red dots across the elder's body. Commander Soin Lim strode through the soldiers with the confidence of someone who had never known doubt, and her cold eyes swept across the chamber before settling on Captain Shin. New orders from High Command, she announced. All Keth assets in this facility are to be terminated immediately. No exceptions, no prisoners. Commander, Yuna said, stepping forward again, even though every instinct screamed at her to stay silent. This creature has intelligence about a threat to the entire galaxy. We need to hear what it has to say. Lim looked at her the way someone might look at an insect that had learned to speak, with annoyance and a complete lack of respect. Who are you? The commander asked. Specialist Yuna Park, she replied, using the title that Shin had given her after her work with the communications. Administrative personnel attached to the 47th Battalion. A clerk, Lim said with a dismissive snort. Stand aside, clerk, and let soldiers do their work. But Yuna did not move, because her administrative mind had already found the solution to this problem in the depths of regulations she had memorized. Years ago, Galactic Union Protocol 7 Alpha 9. She said, requires that all first contact situations with potentially sapient species must include documented attempts at communication before extermination orders can be executed. Lim's face darkened with anger, and her hand moved toward her sidearm. This is not first contact, she growled. We have been at war with these creatures for decades. The war has been with Keth warriors. Yuna continued, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her gut. This is the first documented contact with a Keth capable of verbal communication in a galactic standard language. That legally constitutes a first contact scenario under Protocol 7 Alpha 9, and any officer who ignores that protocol faces court-martial and dishonorable discharge. The chamber fell silent, except for the soft sounds of Keth larvae shifting in their nests. And Yuna felt every eye on her as she stood between a commander and the target of her orders. Captain Shin stepped forward to stand beside her, and then Krethval moved to join them, and then Mireille and Jinho and more soldiers of the 47th until half the battalion stood between Commander Lim and the Elder. We will document the communication attempt, Shin said quietly, and then we will let High Command decide what happens next. Lim looked at the soldiers arrayed against her and seemed to calculate odds that even she could not like. And finally she lowered her hand from her weapon. You have 1 hour, she said. Document your attempt and then we proceed with the mission. Yuna turned back to the Elder and began the work that would change the course of galactic history, asking questions and recording answers and building a case for peace one data point at a time. And when the hour was nearly over, the wall of the chamber exploded inward, and something that was neither Keth nor human came through. Something dark and wrong that made reality itself seem to bend around its edges. The Hollowing had sent a probe to this galaxy, and now everyone in that chamber understood exactly what they were facing. The tunnels beneath the destroyed colony stretched deeper than anyone had mapped, and Yuna followed the soldiers of the 47th Battalion into darkness that seemed to swallow their flashlights and devour their courage. She carried a pack full of communication equipment and spare batteries and medical supplies because Krethval had decided she was more useful as a pack mule than as a fighter. And Yuna did not argue because she knew he was right. The soldier walking beside her was a young man named Jinho Beak, who flinched at every sound and held his weapon with hands that shook so badly Yuna could hear the metal rattle. And she recognized the terror in his eyes because she saw the same thing every time she looked in a mirror. First deployment, she asked quietly. Using the same words Mireille had spoken to her, Jinho nodded without meeting her eyes. And Yuna saw that he was even younger than she had first thought, maybe 19 or 20 at most. And he had the look of someone who had signed up for adventure and found only nightmares. Stay close to me, she said. And the words felt strange coming from her mouth because she had no right to comfort anyone when she was just as scared as he was. But Jinho moved closer anyway, and his breathing steadied just a little. And Yuna understood for the first time that sometimes pretending to be brave was enough. The tunnel opened into a cavern where the ruins of human buildings jutted from the stone like broken bones. And Captain Shin raised his fist to halt the column while scouts moved ahead to check for ambush. Yuna had time to notice the children's toys scattered among the rubble. Before the screaming started, Keth warriors erupted from hidden tunnels with the fury of a disturbed hive. And the 47th Battalion scattered into defensive positions as plasma fire and claws and mandibles turned the cavern into a killing ground. Someone knocked Yuna to the ground, and she rolled behind a chunk of concrete as alien bodies surged past her. And she heard Jinho crying out in fear somewhere nearby, but she could not see him through the chaos. The communication specialist, a thin woman whose name Yuna had never learned, took a Keth blade through her throat and collapsed across the equipment pack. And suddenly nobody was coordinating the battalion's movements and soldiers. or dying because they could not talk to each other. Yuna crawled through the blood and the debris and pulled the communication gear from beneath the dead woman's body. And her fingers worked on instinct as she connected herself to the network and started calling out positions and threats in the calm, steady voice she had used for thousands of transfer confirmations. 2 hostiles flanking from the north tunnel, she said. Sergeant Crethvel needs support at the eastern barricade. Medic required at grid 7. The battalion responded to her voice, like a machine responding to commands. And soldiers moved where she directed them, and threats were neutralized. Before they could overwhelm isolated units, Yuna found Jinho huddled behind a fallen column with his weapon clutched to his chest, and his eyes squeezed shut. And she grabbed his arm and pulled him up and put her mouth next to his ear. "I need you to watch my back," she said. "Can you do that for me?" Jinho opened his eyes and looked at her, and something in her steady gaze reached him through the panic. And he nodded once and raised his weapon and became a soldier again. They fought their way toward the battalion's rally point while Yuna kept talking into the communication system. And she noticed something that the combat specialists had missed because they were too busy fighting to analyze. The Keth were communicating through clicks and pheromones on a specific frequency, and her equipment could detect the patterns even if she could not understand the meaning. But patterns were her specialty. She had spent years finding patterns in transfer requests and supply manifests and personnel data. And the Keth signals were just another type of data to be processed and understood. "Captain Shin," she said into the command channel, "I can hear their communications, and I think I can predict their movements if you give me a few minutes to analyze the patterns." "Do it," Shin replied between bursts of weapons fire. Yuna crouched behind cover with Jinho standing guard over her, and she let her mind sink into the data the way it did during long night shifts when the work became automatic and her thoughts floated free. The Keth signals followed a structure that repeated every 60 seconds, and the variations in the pattern corresponded to movements she had observed during the battle. And if she was right, then the next wave of attackers would come from the southern tunnels in approximately 3 minutes. She was right. The battalion repositioned based on her warning and turned the ambush into a trap. And Keth warriors poured into a crossfire that cut them down before they could reach the human lines. Specialist Park. Shin's voice crackled through her earpiece. "Can you do more than predict their movements?" Yuna thought about the question while another wave of Keth died in the kill zone. And she realized that if she could read their patterns, then maybe she could write new ones. "I can try to feed false signals into their network," she said. "It might draw them away from the spawning facility long enough for a strike team to get through." "That is insane," Crethval growled from somewhere nearby. "Do it," Shin said again. Yuna worked faster than she had ever worked before, and her fingers danced across the communication equipment as she crafted a signal that mimicked the Keth command frequency. And she transmitted a message that she hoped would translate into something like, "All units retreat to defend the northern perimeter." The cavern fell silent. The Keth stopped attacking and turned as one and skittered away into the northern tunnels, leaving behind only their dead and the stunned survivors of the 47th Battalion. "Move now," Shin ordered, "before they figure out what happened." The battalion advanced toward the spawning facility with Yuna in the middle of the formation, and she kept broadcasting false signals to keep the Keth confused and scattered. They reached the facility and breached the outer doors and found themselves in a chamber that pulsed with organic technology and reeked of ammonia and something else that made Yuna's eyes water. But the chamber was not full of Keth warriors. It was full of eggs and larvae and helpless young. And among them stood a single creature larger than any Keth Yuna had seen before, with ancient eyes that looked at the humans not with hatred, but with something that might have been despair. Shin raised his weapon to fire, and the creature raised its forward limbs in a gesture that even Yuna could recognize. It was surrendering, and then it began to speak through a translation device that hung around its neck. And the words it spoke changed everything. Yuna thought she knew about this war. "We are not the enemy," the creature said in a voice like wind through dead leaves. "We run from the enemy, the same enemy that will consume you all if you do not listen to what I have to say." The transport touched down on a landing pad that shook with each distant explosion, and Yuna stumbled out into air that tasted like smoke and copper and fear forward operating base. Talon spread across a valley surrounded by mountains that had been reduced to rubble by orbital bombardment. And everywhere Yuna looked, she saw soldiers running and vehicles moving, and weapons being loaded for a fight that never seemed to end. Mireille grabbed her arm and pulled her toward a bunker, just as something screamed overhead and exploded against a nearby hill. And Yuna felt the shockwave push against her chest, like a giant hand trying to knock her down. "Welcome to Meridian 6. Mireille said with a smile that held no humor at all. The command bunker was a maze of tunnels carved into the bedrock, and Mireille led Yuna through corridors filled with wounded soldiers and exhausted medics until they reached an office where a human man in officer's armor sat behind a desk covered in tactical displays. Captain Deho Shin looked up as they entered, and his dark eyes moved over Yuna with an assessment that made her feel like a piece of equipment being evaluated for usefulness. "This is the clerk," Mireille said. "The one from the transfer error." Shin pulled up a file on his display and read through it while Yuna stood at attention because that seemed like the right thing to do, even though she had no military training and no idea what she was doing. "You have processed over 2 million transfer requests in your career," Shin said, and his voice was flat and tired and held no judgment. "You have 0 combat experience and 0 weapons training, and you have never been off Nexus 7 before today." "Yes, sir," Yuna said, because that was all she could say. "I am assigning you to logistics," Shin continued. "You will work with Supply Sergeant Krethval to manage the distribution of ammunition and medical supplies to our forward units. And you will stay behind the front lines where you might actually survive long enough for your transfer reversal to come through." Yuna felt a tiny spark of hope flicker in her chest at those words. But before she could respond, a siren began to wail throughout the bunker, and red lights flashed in the corridors. "Keth assault," someone shouted from the hallway. "Multiple breaching pods incoming." Shin grabbed his weapon and ran for the door without another word. And Mireille pushed Yuna toward the back of the bunker, where the logistics section was supposed to be safe from the fighting. The next few hours were a blur of terror and noise as the battle raged above and around them. And Yuna huddled in a corner of the supply bunker, while explosions shook dust from the ceiling and the screams of soldiers and aliens mixed together into a symphony of violence. Sergeant Krethval was a Sarati who stood nearly 3 meters tall with scales, the color of dried blood, and cybernetic limbs that had replaced the ones he lost in battles Yuna could not imagine. And he looked at her with vertical pupils that held nothing but contempt for the soft clerk who had stumbled into his war. "Stay out of the way," he growled in a voice like grinding stones. "Touch nothing and speak to no one, and maybe you will live to see the morning." Yuna pressed herself against the wall and tried to make herself as small as possible, while Krethval directed his team to move supplies through the chaos. And she watched them work with a precision and efficiency that made her own administrative skills seem worthless by comparison. And then the ceiling exploded. A Keth breaching pod smashed through the reinforced concrete like a fist through paper, and insectoid warriors poured into the bunker with mandibles clicking and claws slashing at everything that moved. Krethval roared and charged into the swarm with his cybernetic arms, crushing chitin and tearing limbs. But more. Keth kept coming, and the supply team fell back, and Yuna found herself alone in a corner surrounded by wounded soldiers who could not fight. The last of the combat personnel retreated to hold a choke point in the corridor, and Yuna was left with 3 wounded humans in a dying Deshan, and no weapons and no training, and no way to survive what was coming. But she had something else. She had spent 3 years learning every system on Nexus 7, and military bases used the same basic infrastructure because the Galactic Union loved standardization. Above all else, Yuna ran to the supply terminal, and her fingers flew across the controls as Keth warriors skittered toward her across the floor. And she found what she was looking for in the base defense subroutines that had been deactivated to save power. The base had automated turrets in every corridor, but they had been shut down months ago when the power grid became unstable. And the logistics bunker had its own backup generator that nobody used because ammunition was more important than convenience. Yuna rerouted power from the lighting and the climate control and every non-essential system she could find, and she felt the floor vibrate as the dormant turrets hummed to life for the first time in months. The Keth warrior closest to her raised its bladed arm to strike, and then the turret above the door opened fire, and the creature exploded into fragments of chitin and green ichor that splattered across Yuna's face. More turrets activated throughout the bunker, and the Keth assault faltered as automated weapons cut through their ranks with merciless precision. And Yuna kept working at the terminal because stopping meant dying, and she refused to die in a supply bunker on a burning world because of a typing error. Krethval and his team pushed back into us the bunker as the last of the Keth fell, and the Sarati stared at Yuna with an expression she had never seen on his scarred face before. It might have been respect. "You did this," he said, and it was not a question. Yuna nodded because her voice had abandoned her along with her ability to stand, and she slid down the wall and sat in a puddle of alien blood and tried to remember how to breathe. Myray found her there an hour later after the all-clear sounded, and the medic knelt beside her and checked her vital signs and said nothing about the tears streaming down Yuna's face. "You saved 12 lives tonight," Myray said quietly. "The wounded soldiers in this bunker would be dead without you. I just push buttons," Yuna whispered, "and sometimes pushing the right buttons is what saves the world." Captain Shin arrived before dawn with new orders that made Yuna's fragile hope shatter into pieces, because Command had decided that the 47th Battalion would advance into Keth territory to disable a spawning facility that was producing thousands of new warriors every day. Every available body was needed for the assault, and that included one data clerk who had proven she could think under pressure. Yuna looked at the tactical display showing their target deep in enemy territory, and she understood that the logistics bunker had been her last safe place. Now she would walk into the heart of the swarm. Yuna Park stared at the glowing screen until her eyes burned and her vision blurred at the edges. But she could not stop working because 300 transfer requests waited in her queue, and the night shift had no end in sight. The administrative hub of Space Station Nexus 7 hummed with the quiet energy of 1,000 machines, processing data across 12 star systems. And Yuna sat alone in her small cubicle surrounded by floating holographic displays that showed names and numbers and destinations she barely registered anymore. She had worked 16 hours straight because her colleague Hendrix had called in sick, and someone had to process the military transfers before the morning deadline. And that someone was always Yuna because she never complained and she never said no. Her fingers moved across the haptic keyboard with the speed of years of practice, approving requests and denying others and routing soldiers and officers to their assigned posts across the galaxy. and each keystroke sent a living being somewhere new while she remained in the same chair she had occupied for 3 years. The clock on her display showed 4 in the morning station time, and Una reached for her cold coffee with one hand while the other continued typing. Because stopping meant falling behind, and falling behind meant disappointing Coordinator Vrel, and disappointing anyone made her stomach twist with anxiety. Transfer request 4847 appeared on her screen. A routine deployment order for Sergeant Kim Tae-eun to the Warfront front where the Galactic Union battled the insectoid Keth Swarm, in a war that had lasted longer than Una had been alive. She typed the confirmation code without thinking, her muscle memory taking over while her exhausted brain drifted somewhere between sleep and waking, and her fingers punched in the identification number that would send another soldier to fight and possibly die on a burning world. The system chimed its approval, and the request vanished, and the next one appeared, and Una kept working because that was what she did, and that was all she knew. 40 minutes later, she finished the queue and leaned back in her chair, and finally allowed herself to close her eyes for just a moment. But the moment stretched into minutes, and the minutes might have become hours if her personal communicator had not started screaming with an urgent alert. She jerked awake and grabbed the device and saw a message that made no sense at all. Deployment confirmed, Park, YUN, a personnel. ID 7749 Alpha 3. Destination, Warfront Front Transport. Departing 0600 hours. Una read the message 3 times before meaning penetrated her foggy brain. And then she felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins as she realized what she had done. She had entered her own identification code instead of Sergeant Kim's. She had sent herself to war. Her hand shook as she pulled up the transfer log and searched for the error. And there it was in glowing text that seemed to mock her with its permanence. Her name and her number attached to a deployment order that had already propagated through 17 different military databases across the quadrant. Una ran through the corridors of the administrative hub with her heart pounding and her breath coming in short gasps. And she burst into Coordinator Vrel's office without knocking or waiting or following any of the protocols she normally obeyed without question. The Veshan looked up from his own work with all 4 of his arms pausing over his console, and his large dark eyes blinked slowly as Una stammered out her mistake in a voice that cracked with panic. "I need to reverse it," she begged. "Please tell me you can reverse it right now before the transport arrives." Coordinator Vrel's secondary arms folded across his chest while his primary arms pulled up the relevant files, and he studied the data for a long moment before his thin mouth pressed into a line that Una had learned to recognize as disappointment. "The order has been confirmed by 7 different command structures," he said in his calm, measured voice that never rose or fell regardless of the crisis. "Reversing it will require authorization from each one, and that process takes 6 standard weeks at minimum." 6 weeks, Una repeated, and the words sounded hollow and distant as if someone else had spoken them. "Your transport departs in 90 minutes. Vrel continued. "I suggest you pack what you need and report to Docking Bay 12. Una wanted to argue and wanted to scream, and wanted to wake up from this nightmare that could not possibly be real. But Vrel had already returned to his work as if sending a data clerk to the deadliest war zone in the galaxy was just another administrative matter to be filed and forgotten. She walked back to her quarters in a daze and packed a small bag with trembling hands and tried to remember if she had ever fired a weapon or thrown a punch or done anything in her 24 years of life that had prepared her for combat. The answer was no. The military transport was a gray metal beast that squatted in the docking bay like a predator waiting to swallow her whole. and Yuna climbed aboard with legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. The interior was cramped and loud and filled with soldiers who looked at her with expressions ranging from confusion to pity to outright contempt, because her civilian clothes and her soft hands and her terrified eyes marked her as something that did not belong, a massive reptilian Sarati with cybernetic limbs that gleamed under the harsh lights leaned close to a human woman in combat armor and said something that made them both laugh. And Yuna knew without hearing the words that she was the joke. She found an empty seat in the corner and strapped herself in and clutched her bag to her chest like a shield that could protect her from the nightmare unfolding around her. The transport shuddered as it lifted off, and Yuna watched through a small viewport as Nexus 7 grew smaller and smaller until it was just another point of light among millions, and she realized that she might never see it again. The journey took 18 hours, and Yuna did not sleep because every time she closed her eyes, she saw visions of insectoid monsters tearing her apart with mandibles and claws. And the soldiers around her spoke of battles and casualties and friends they had, lost in voices that were far too casual for the horrors they described. A human woman with medic insignia on her armor sat down beside Yuna during the final hour of the flight and studied her with eyes that had seen too much death to hold any softness. First deployment? The medic asked. Though it was not really a question, Yuna nodded because words would not come. Stick close to me when we land, the medic said. My name is Myray, and I will try to keep you alive long enough for someone to sort out whatever mistake put you on this transport. Before Yuna could respond, the pilot's voice crackled through the speakers, announcing their arrival. And the transport dropped out of hyperspace with a lurch that made her stomach flip. She looked through the viewport and saw a planet wreathed in fire and smoke, its surface scarred by explosions that flickered like dying stars. And beyond it, a fleet of Keth hive ships darkened, the stars like a swarm of locusts preparing to devour everything in their path. Yuna Park, data clerk and processor of transfer requests, had arrived at War,